Let's talk about internationalization and localization. In many cases, your application is going to need to be accessible in multiple languages. Fortunately for us, Aurelia has some very easy ways to handle having any number of language translations in your application, and really pretty easily being able to toggle between them and offering ways to incorporate translation files that can be pretty modularly ported throughout your application without causing too much trouble. Typically, it would be a good idea to consider internationalization right at the beginning when you're creating your application. Now we're going to kind of try to retrofit our blog a little bit, and we're probably not going to hit everything. In fact, I know we're not going to hit everything, but this would have all been much easier if it had been planned from the beginning. So that being said, let's go ahead and retrofit. So what I'm going to do is go to my command line, and I'm going to install a few things. So we'll do AU install. First, we're going to use the Aurelia Internationalization, and that's i18n there, stands for internationalization. And this also is backed by the i18 next module, so we can use i18 next and install that as well. And we'll want to make sure we save that, of course. What I will say too is you should also, if you want to use some sort of different backend plugin to pull translations from your JSON files, you can do that as well. But just to keep things simple, we're going to use the built-in backend and use Aurelia's loader as well. So all we need to do is the installation that we just did. Let's go into our code, and first I'm going to look at the Aurelia project folder and go to aurelia.json and check out the installation here. And okay, we've got i18n and we've got the i18 next here. So let's adjust this path a little bit to make sure we are actually using the distribution for i18 next. So this is /dist and then /umd. And I believe that should, the main here, then it becomes i18 next. And everything is fine with the Aurelia i18n. So yeah, do make sure that the path is correct whenever you do use that Aurelia installer. Sometimes it is suboptimal. So we have that configured, which is great. The next thing we're going to do is quickly build out some translation files. So what I'm going to do is go into my source directory, and I see I have all these top level folders, top level directories within my source directory. I'm going to create a different folder for locales. So we'll just create a folder real quick and say locales. And within that folder, I'm going to create a subfolder for each locale that we want to include. So in this case, I think I'm going to create a locale for English. So we'll do a new folder. And what I'm going to do is actually use English and say it's Canadian English. And you'll see why I'm doing that later, but mostly it's just to kind of be able to easily reference that translation using the moment.js library. You can just say en. This is just how I choose to do it. And then so I'm going to also add a folder for French, and we'll just say that, yeah, my two possibilities, just to keep things simple, are going to be English and French here. And so within these English and French directories are going to be where my JSON files live. So for smaller projects, usually you can just create a new file, and maybe you'll save that in there and say it's translations.json or translation.json, and then maybe you create another translation JSON file under the French folder as well. But what I actually like doing, and what's typically a pretty good idea for larger projects, is to actually namespace. And so you'd actually create several JSON files within each of these subfolders in locales. And what you're able to do is toggle between those based on perhaps where you are in the site. You could divide those up in several different ways. So what I'm actually going to do is, instead of calling this translation.json, I'm going to rename this and call it nav.json. And so this is going to This will contain the translations for my main site navigation, and then perhaps I'll create another new file. I'll save this as the post form.json, and that'll contain all the translations for my post form. And I could basically have a number of these translation files containing JSON for all the translations that I have. So what I'll also do is within my French subfolder, I'll create a new file and save that as nav.json. And again, create another one called postform.json. And it would be smart of me to make sure that my translation files between the two subdirectories, or however many subdirectories and locale I have, are the same between all the different subdirectories. And that way I can make sure that I have translations that are kind of matching each other between the different languages. Okay, so that being said, let's build out our nav.json file. So I've already done the work of kind of going through our site and looking at what's in the nav bar. So I'm just going to go ahead and build the translations here. So what I'll do is have a home page translation. That'll just be home. And then I'll also have a login translation. That'll be login. Or rather, I'll use login as 2 words there. Then we can have a sign up translation. That'll be sign up. Then we will have a new post translation. That'll just be new post. And finally, we'll have a log out translation. And that'll just be log out. And that's really simple, and that's everything that's in our nav bar. And so instead of having this in one kind of massive translation file with everything else in our all the other translations we might need for our site, we just have it in this nav.json file, and it's nice and simple. So what I'm going to do is copy this over to the French translation, except now I'm going to actually add my French translations here. So for homepage, instead of home, it is accueil. So we'll do that, and then in login, it will be connecter, and in sign up, s'inscrire. In new post, it'll be créer un article, and for log out, it will be se déconnecter, and that will be our nav translations. So again, really simple between the two. So theoretically, you could imagine that in our site, we'll just be seeing this, and we could potentially hit some sort of flag, or maybe the actual word for French, and then we would all of a sudden start seeing these options, and that's what we're going to make happen. So that's great. We can go over to our postform.json now, and again, I've kind of looked at everything we might need in the post form, and so we'll need the title label for the post form. That'll just be title, and the body label for the post form, that'll be body. We will need to know how to add a tag, and that will be add tag. We will need to have some sort of label for editing a post, and let's get that casing correct. And then we'll also need to have one for creating a post, and finally, let's do a title placeholder. And this will be the placeholder text that appears when you are looking kind of at a blank title. And it could say your post title. And so we're just basically setting the stage for having all these translations at the ready when we actually do the implementation. So let's go back to our post-form JSON for French, and let's just quickly write this out. Titre and body, we'll just say content, contenu, and add tag, we'll ajouter marque, edit post, modifier article, créer article, and title placeholder, votre titre d'article. Perfect. So we've done a pretty decent job here of, at least for the nav bar and the post form, coming up with our translations. And we could, of course, go through the exercise of doing the entire site, but I mostly just want to illustrate these concepts, and perhaps you could later on go back and kind of fill in the blanks using kind of the things that we've learned here. So great, we've installed the necessary packages, and we've configured our translation files, so we can close those. So now what we need to do is actually register the plugin. So we've done plugins before. If we go to our main.js, we registered our validation plugin before. Well, now we're going to need to register our internationalization plugin. So we can do that in a similar fashion. Aurelia-I18n in a similar way, but we're actually going to need to do a little further configuration. So what we can do is pass a second argument here and configure the instance of Aurelia-I18n and actually pass a function here. So what we'll actually need to do first is import some modules here, and we will bring in the i18n plugin and the backend from Aurelia-I18n. And again, this will be used actually within our configuration of the plugin here. So we had discussed that you can use a lot of different backend options, but in this case, we're just going to use the built-in backend, and we're going to use the Aurelia loader as well. And this is kind of like the simplest possible implementation. So we'll configure this instance, use the backend as discussed. So we can use that backend that we've imported with the Aurelia loader. Great. So that's one piece of the configuration. And then we'll need to return an instance.setup. And this is the setup that we do here is actually a part of i18 Next. So to know what kind of options you can use in the setup, you can actually go to i18next.com and kind of see how to many different ways to configure this, but we're going to really do the most basic configuration that we really need to. So let's talk about doing the backend configuration. We need to set the load path. So our load path is just going to be equal to where we're going to find our translation files. So those are in locales, and then slash the languages if you look on the sidebar here, and then the namespace location. So let's go ahead and do that, locales, and then we can say it'll be where the languages are, and then finally it'll be based on the namespace, and they are JSON files. So that's a real simple way that we can kind of tell our plugin where the backend needs to load our translation files from. The default language is going to be our English or English Canadian, which we've specified as the subfolder there. And a fallback language we can specify would be French, because that's the only other language we have. We need to tell it the namespaces that we have. So we've already discussed that right now we have the nav namespace and we have the post form namespace. And of course, if we add any other namespaces within our subdirectories and our locales, then we'll add them to this namespace option here. And then finally, it would be good to set debug to false. You can set debug to true if you're having some issues with your plugin, and what that'll do is just start logging quite a bit of information in your console, which could help you see what might be going wrong. So great, that's a little bit of work here in the main.js file, but we've basically done our minimal configuration for this plugin, which is great. So what we'll want to do now is actually go back into our Aurelia JSON file for a little more configuration. And What's important here is that we're going to want to tell our application when it's building and when it's bundling our app that we want to also make sure we keep track of those JSON files that we just created. So if we go, for example, here under the bundles property of build here, we want to make sure that we're not just getting these CSS and HTML text resources. We also want JSON because that is, again, our translation file types. And then also, if we scroll down below our dependencies here, we can find this loader property. And for our plugins, well, now we have an additional extension that we need to keep track of. And so we'll want to add .json there. And then finally, we're also going to want to set this stub property to false. And you need to do so if you want to dynamically require text like we're doing here with our JSON files. So those are the changes that you need to make to the Aurelia-Based .json file to make this work, at least with this Aurelia CLI project. It would be a little different if you are using some different loaders or a different build process. But that is the configuration that we need to do. So that's great. That was a little bit of work, but now what we can do is actually start jumping back into our code base that we're familiar with. So let's work on our navbar. Let's go to our app.html file. And of course, we have our navbar here. And so let's just mess around a little bit with adding translations here. So what we can do is use a custom attribute. So we'll do that on our link here for the home page. Let's do T, and that's our custom attribute. And this will be equal to, let's say our namespace first. So it's going to be the nav namespace. And then if I go open that nav.json, well, it's going to be the home property of that object there. So that's all you actually need to do to make sure that the contents of this tag, so this home now, no matter what I call it right now, what it's going to do is actually use the lookup in our translation. Of course, I would be smart to just keep my code intuitive and just say home there. But that's great. So that'll just say home. And I can actually go back and let's just restart the application here. And if I go to my app, give it a refresh, well, okay, so it says home. That doesn't really give me a whole lot of information, because what I'd really be interested in is if I toggled to the French language, will it actually do the translation for me? So what I propose we do is, if we look on our sidebar here in this elsewhere section, let's go ahead and change that a little bit to allow us to toggle between our languages. So we're going to do that now. Let's go back to our code and scroll down to our sidebar here, and we'll just change this to say language, and we'll make this 2 options. So let's make this English, and let's make this Français, and then we can delegate the click here to a method on our view model, and we can just say set locale, and let's just pass a variable here that says Canadian English, and again do the same for our French link. So I'll just copy that on over and say set locale is French. Great. And so what I can do is go to my app.js and let us pull in our internationalization module. So we can pull in the i18n from Aurelia-i18n. Let's use dependency injection to bring that in, included in our constructor. Great. So now what I can do is I can, again, actually create this set locale method here. So I'll just scroll all the way down, and we'll add it down here. Set locale. And this actually takes the locale. So then I can use this .i18n.setLocale is the method on our i18n class here. And locale. Okay, perfect. So let's go back to our application. And okay, so now we have English here, we have French here. So if I click English, yeah, nothing happens. If I click French, okay. So we are actually doing our translations here in real time. I can toggle between them, and that looks pretty good to me. So let's go ahead and round out our navbar real quick. Let's go back to our app.html file, scroll back up, and I'm just going to copy this translation, this T custom attribute here, and we'll just start populating this. This will be nav login. This one will be nav sign up. This one will be nav new post. And this one will be nav logout. Alrighty, let's get back here. Let's change to the French translations. And yeah, our navbar changes just as we'd expect it. So this was a little bit of configuration with respect to the plugin in our Aurelia.json file, but now we can pretty easily say that we are starting to translate to French. I can sign in as Jane Doe. And yeah, so we can see our translations are definitely carrying over. So that's perfect.